Maybe you're experiencing this right now. The everyday certainties are starting to disappear. You feel the ground beneath you becoming unstable. You're not entirely sure why, but you sense that something is changing. The old world no longer holds, and the new one hasn't taken shape yet. You may have just found yourself at the beginning of a story. Stay with me, and in this video, I'll help you find your bearings inside it. Welcome to Mini Mind Hack. We'll trace a simple story frame often called the hero's journey, explain why those story shapes carry psychological weight, and offer a gentle framework. Not a rigid how-to, but an orientation that can help you notice what's happening inside you and respond in a way that feels generative rather than performative. Stories help people organize experience. When routine breaks, the mind reaches for shape. A story gives a beginning, a middle with trials, and an ending that promises meaning. That is why myths persist. Their form mirrors patterns of change we live through. But myths are maps, not mandates. The point is, understanding the terrain, not forcing a stage transformation. Joseph Campbell, an American comparative mythologist, compared stories from many different cultures, myths, legends, and religious narratives, and identified a recurring pattern. Despite their differences, these stories often share a similar structure. A figure begins in an ordinary world, is disrupted or called away from what is familiar, initially resists, then enters uncertain territory, encounters tests, allies, and obstacles, and eventually returns changed by what they have learned or endured. Campbell referred to this recurring structure as the hero's journey. His contribution was not a call for people to behave heroically, nor a self-improvement program. It was a descriptive insight. Across cultures, people have repeatedly used the same narrative shape to make sense of disruption, uncertainty, and profound change. Campbell's observation is useful because it points to a form people have long used to orient themselves during periods of upheaval. To move from stories to psychology, we need a way to explain why the same narrative shapes recur inside different people's minds. That is where Carl Gustav Jung comes in. Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and the founder of analytical psychology. Early in his career, he worked at Clinic in Zurich and briefly collaborated with Sigmund Freud before developing his own ideas. Jung became best known for proposing the notions of the collective unconscious and archetypes, recurring symbolic motifs that show up in dreams, myths, and creative work across cultures. He argued that these archetypes are not literal instructions, but symbolic ways the psyche represents inner processes. For our purposes, Jung gives a psychological mechanism. When something in your life no longer fits, a story that maps a call, trials, and slow integration feels true, because those symbolic motifs mirror how inner reconfiguration often proceeds. In recent decades, writers and therapists translated these ideas into accessible language. Christopher Vogler adapted Campbell's structure for storytellers in film and literature. Dan McAdams, a psychologist, turned the focus to narrative identity, how people tell the story of who they are. James Hollis, a Jung-oriented therapist, has written about midlife and transitions, arguing that these phases call for depth, not quick fixes. And sociologists like Hartmut Rosa remind us that social rhythms and expectations shape when and how such transitions occur. Mentioning these voices anchors the idea. The hero's journey is a cultural pattern observed across disciplines, not a self-help slogan. It helps to be precise about what typically happens inside a transition. This is not a motivational movie montage. It is a process that usually unfolds over time and alters experience in specific ways. First comes a disturbance in baseline meaning. Small routines stop registering as meaningful. Tasks you did automatically begin to require effort. You can notice that the morning rituals that used to feel reassuring no longer do. You start scrolling in the evenings, sign up for a course 1 month, abandon it the next, and wake with a quiet unease. That drifting sense is the call in mythic terms. Not a trumpet, but a mismatch between old maps and present life. Second, resistance often follows. The understandable reaction is to tighten control, Set new goals, tidy schedules, buy a program promising clarity. This is how many people try to reduce uncertainty quickly. Sometimes these moves help temporarily. Often they keep you in loops of shallow fixes. Resistance is energy put toward predictability. It isn't bad in itself, but unexamined it can postpone genuine exploration. Third comes testing and frequent failure. If you experiment, try a new activity, talk to someone differently, change a work approach, many attempts will feel partial or fail. Failures in this phase are information. They show limits, not moral worth. Fourth, integration unfolds slowly. It rarely arrives as a single breakthrough. Instead, preferences shift. Certain activities return as quietly nourishing, and attention settles more steadily. Integration is not a victory parade. It is the slow retuning of appetite and tolerance that makes new patterns possible. You can look for behavioral and temporal markers across these phases. Early, boredom, low energy, restless searching. Middle, sudden goals, frequent course enrollments, social withdrawal, or intense help-seeking. Later, small rituals, renewed curiosity in particular activities, and an increased capacity to sit with ambiguity. Putting names to these patterns reduces shame. It lets you see the experience as data rather than a verdict. So how can the hero's journey function as a helpful frame without becoming an obligation to suffer or a checklist to complete? Think of it as a compass with 3 modest points of orientation. 1. Use the idea as a map, not a moral test. Pause and locate yourself. The map distinguishes disturbance, testing, and integration. Naming the phase you're in changes the question from "what's wrong with me" to "what kind of information am I getting now?" That shift is practical. It opens curiosity rather than self-blame. You don't have to act immediately. Noticing is itself a useful stance. 2. Cultivate small stabilizing structures that give the nervous system predictable inputs. I'm not offering a to-do list. Think instead of gentle scaffolding, predictable patterns that create contrast with the noisy environment. These might be brief moments in the day that are not performance-oriented, small practices that are repeatable, or spaces where you allow yourself to be unproductive. The function of these structures is not to fix identity, but to provide steady signals so you can better evaluate experiments. Over time, stable inputs help the mind learn what actually soothes and what merely distracts. 3. Treat narrative as a deliberate, interpretive tool rather than a demand. Ask different questions. Not, "how do I become a better person?" but "what story would help me see what's changing?" Or, "which small attempts left me feeling less restive?" These are invitations to reflection, not instructions. They help you reframe experiences as parts of a process and identify experiments you might try, not as obligations, but as explorations. Concrete examples help clarify the difference between being guided and being directed. If you notice your evenings are filled with shallow activities, you might experiment with one small change that feels authentically interesting rather than trendy. If you find online workshops unrewarding, you might try one alternative contact, a short conversation with a colleague or a creative task, simply to see how it lands. These are personal probes, not a universal regimen. It is also important to name limits and risks. The heroic frame can be misused. Some cultures around self-development treat struggle as status. The idea that visible hardship equals authenticity. That narrative encourages endurance of toxic situations and elevates spectacle over steady care. Another common trap is expecting a single dramatic turn. Most real change is cumulative and often invisible in daily increments. Expecting fireworks sets you up for disappointment. If you want to orient yourself by this frame, consider a modest set of reflective moves rather than a prescribed program. Map what used to feel familiar and what no longer fits. Notice recurring attempts and what they reveal. Try low-cost, low-stakes experiments that teach you about preference rather than prove your value. And protect spaces where the world can speak to you. Slow conversation, art, or time outdoors. Moments Hartmut Rosa describes as resonance. where you are addressed by the world rather than treating everything as a resource. The point is not to hand you a sequence of tasks. It is to offer a way of seeing that respects your autonomy. A method to interpret confusion so you can decide for yourself what experiments are worth trying. Think of the hero's journey as a structural vocabulary that helps you name phases and respond with curiosity and care, not as a script you must perform. If this reframe shifted how you think about your own disorientation, its value is immediate. It allows you to step back from urgency and to act with patience. In the middle of confusion, the most generative moves are often quiet. Notice where you are. Try something small that interests you, and tell one person you trust what you're exploring. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate you sticking with the whole video. If this resonated, a like, comment, or subscribe helps this work reach more people than you might expect, and your feedback actually shapes what I make next. I hope you found something useful here, and I'd love to see you back for the next one.